Welcome to the Reaching Up Podcast. I'm Ron Farris.
And I'm Daniel Locke.
Today we are going to talk about empathy,
Yes,
something that men never talk about.
correct. Correct.
They have no idea what we're talking about. So
Yeah.
hopefully all the men out there are going to listen in today and learn a little bit about what this crazy concept of empathy is.
Mm-hmm.
So starting right off the bat with the scientific community's take on empathy, since I don't know anything about it, naturally, they have actually confirmed, the scientists have, that empathy is not something that necessarily is instinctive, that it seems to look like more of an acquired skill. So just like, having sports ability or learning to handle difficult relationships or conflict, it may be something that just doesn't come naturally to us.
That would make sense.
Yeah, I was pleased to hear that because I was, wanting to kick myself for taking so long to figure this one out.
Yeah. So it's something we can practice to be better at.
That's exactly right. So, the things we talk about today then are basically principles and precepts that one may choose to acquire or practice rather than something, we're not going to point out some deficiency in people that, makes them mentally ill or anything, even though it is Mental Illness Awareness Month. Empathy is one of those things that that is just not talked about. I mean, I made it quite a few years with never having a discussion about empathy. I actually didn't have a discussion about empathy until I was criticized for not being an empathetic person, and I had to go, look it up.
Yeah.
And then I really did start to get my head around it. So let's talk about what it is. So empathy, by the dictionary, is the action. It's something we do. The action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another person. So empathy immediately seems, based on everything I've looked at, to essentially be a relational skill. You can't practice. I didn't find anybody saying you can practice self-empathy. I mean, it's your job to know what you're feeling. It's our job, as we've talked about, to be in touch with our emotions. We talk a lot about that. We all need an emotions wheel so we can, stop and, check real quick and figure out what we're actually feeling, because that's apparently something that doesn't come so naturally to us either.
Mm-hmm.
But this idea of empathizing is to look at another person in a relationship or in a business relationship or in a personal relationship, an intimate relationship, or just in an argument or in the subway or wherever we may be, and just have some consideration and thought process and maybe some realization about what they're experiencing on an emotional level.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting thing. Of course, the question that has to be asked is, why is that so important? Well, it's very interesting. As I got into the discussion of it, one more scientific fact. It seems in the scientific community, there's not a lot of agreement on anything ever.
Mm-hmm.
But as it turns out, on this one, there is a general agreement in the scientific community that there are basically two concepts of empathy out there. One is cognitive and one is affective. Now, we're not scientists, and we don't want anybody to, walk down the street saying, "Oh, well, this is cognitive empathy that I'm experiencing." But understanding it from a scientific or a factual perspective, and science just tries to confirm facts, is always helpful to me. Now, maybe not everybody, but certainly to me.
Mm-hmm.
I want to understand what the rules are. That's just I guess I'm a lawyer, I want to know what the rule is so I can figure out whether I'm going to follow the rule or not, or, how to do that. But empathy is these two interconnected elements of cognitive empathy, which is understanding or recognizing the emotions another person is experiencing, which is the general, commonly thought of expression of empathy. I can empathize with you. What I'm saying when I say that is exactly what cognitive empathy would say. I am cognitively understanding something you are experiencing, and that's easy enough for me to understand. But then the other side of this, which is really, to me, is equally important, is this notion of affective empathy, which refers to actually feeling or sharing those emotions myself. So it's one thing for me to understand the emotions you're experiencing and to respect that and to take that into consideration as I choose my words or I choose my response to whatever it is that we're experiencing. It's another thing entirely for me to internalize and experience and feel your pain or your anger or your hatred, or your love, that's a totally different experience. That is more personal to me. And I had never thought about that. But it makes empathy probably a pretty important part of having any kind of relationship, because, it's going to be a pretty cold one, it's going to be a pretty cold relationship if you have no concept of the emotional experience that the other person in this relationship is having.
Mm-hmm. And I think one distinction I want to make is it's different than sympathy. So empathy and sympathy, I've always thought of them very similarly, and they're not the same.
Alike.
They do.
Yeah.
So you think they're close to the same thing,
Yeah.
but sympathy is more of a feeling of pity, almost a feeling of compassion. You can have compassion or sorrow, but it's more pity for someone else's misfortune.
Mm-hmm.
So I think of it like if there's I hear the term the pit of despair. Somebody's in the pit of despair or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Sympathy will throw in a ladder or toss down some snacks and be like, man, I see you down there. That kind of sucks. Empathy, you're going to crawl down in the pit with them and give them the snack, walk through it with them.
And you're going to be more helpful to them because you understand what their experience is like.
Or you're trying to understand what they're experiencing.
Well, right. Well, I think if you've achieved empathy, you're actually hammering right close to what they're experiencing so that you can identify with them.
Yeah.
And, I can see how that's a huge skill. If somebody wants to say that they're a successful human being, the ability to empathize really is in that list of things that people really, do probably want to check out. And interestingly, the opposite of that, whenever our clinicians are out there trying to diagnose things like narcissistic personality disorder or schizophrenia, or things of that nature, which are pathological issues, bipolar disorder, psychopathy, which is like the state of being a psychopath. We all use that word a lot, especially in the movies. But there are people out there who are genuinely psychopathic. That's all of those conditions. One of the markers that the clinicians use to diagnose whether those things are present is whether or not that patient demonstrates the ability to empathize. So, I guess the lesson there is that if you don't learn to master empathy, you may end up being labeled a narcissist or a psychopath. And, if that's not your goal, then you may want to listen up on this one. But, so we've talked a little bit about the scientific side. Let's talk about the practical side. So, excessive empathy. Let's talk about that. So, like anything else, it seems like in human beings, too little can be a bad thing, and too much can be a bad thing.
Yes.
So the idea is like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, to get it just right. And that balance in life is sort of like the key on everything, right? It just seems like everything we talk about that ends up being something, we say that at some point in time. It's really a matter of balance, and you hear that all the time. But on this area of empathy, excessive empathy can actually be one of the major factors that contributes to what's called pathological altruism. Pathological meaning that it's dangerous or deadly. And then altruism, which is helping people. And in our kinds of words, that you would hear people say, well, I'm burned out. You can also, as a result of this pathological altruism, or an excessive amount of empathy for other people, you can end up experiencing their shame. That's called carried shame. We talked about that in our episode on shame and guilt. You can end up carrying their anxiety, and your life, which would otherwise be calm and peaceful, becomes anxious because you're carrying the burdens of the people that you're dealing with. That is an example of this. Depression is another thing that can set in on people that have too much empathy. And this is particularly problematic, as you might imagine, in the area in the world of healthcare workers, caregivers. I've been there and done that, and I understand this. So the lesson there is that when one is not, as we've said with everything else, it's important to be aware of it as a thing. Empathy is an important aspect of a healthy, successful human life, particularly if we're wanting to have relationships with other people, which we should all want, because relationships good, no relationships bad. And empathy is an important part of a holistic, successful relationship. I would argue, of all the people I've known, and I've known lots of people, I continually hear people saying, whether they say it this way or not, what I hear them saying is that they just consider themselves to suck at some aspect of relationships. Relationships are very hard. They're very hard. And so when we talk about things like empathy, if somebody's tempted to go listen to the podcast on how to make $1 million before you're 25, go ahead and do that. But you're probably going to get more out of a discussion of empathy. You're going to have more to show for it. So hopefully we haven't lost all our listeners at this point, but let's do talk about empathy in our own lives. What are you? Give us an example of, or do you have one of where you've found empathy to be something important in the way you handle something?
Yeah, I think somebody. So. I think something you said earlier that I think is really important is just, it's almost said every word but boundaries. And I think when we talked about the episode on boundaries, it makes sense that, I don't know, it's kind of a weird thing to say, well, you need to be careful how much you care. That's what it can come across as, I think, if you're like, well, be careful of showing too much empathy. But I think it's absolutely right that a good understanding of caring for someone, but not, not over caring, I guess is the word. And that sounds kind of weird, but not caring to the point that it's unhelpful. But I think as I'm going through that, I don't know, there's some verses that come to mind that I think that are helpful. And that's how I kind of look at it. Which is the first one's kind of the Romans 12:15. A lot of people have heard this. You kind of hear it quoted, but it's rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. And then it goes on to say, mourn with those who mourn, like show empathy. This verse is literally just saying show empathy, like step into it with those. If somebody's celebrating, don't get angry at their success, celebrate with them. If they're upset about something, like figure out why they're upset and sharing that. And I think you're right. We do just need to be careful and know what part of that is our responsibility, because it's not our responsibility to fix it or make it better. And I think sometimes those of us who are fixers want to fix it, and sometimes you just need to be present and just be an active listener, and that's what's going to be helpful in that situation.
Man, that is so hard for me, because I don't know. When you talk about people being fixers, I guess there is such a thing, but I am one of those people that when someone shares with me that they are suffering, and I'm going to use this as a personal example of exactly what we're talking about. I was I go to a men's group, and in that men's group, all of the men in that group are trying to work on improving their relationships, mostly in their marriages. And they have been struggling with that for some time. That's how they typically end up in this group. And I've been going to that group for almost 3 years. And a handful of those guys, 3 or 4 of them, who I've come to love them all, are with all of their effort, they're going in the wrong direction, and the relationship is suffering. It's getting worse, not better. And there was a particular night a few weeks ago where several of them that I thought were making progress, and I was happy for them, I was sharing their joy. They walked in, and basically 3 or 4 of them the same night, said that they were, that the word divorce was coming up. Having been through a divorce myself, I tanked pretty quick. In fact, it just knocked the breath out of me. And of course, what I was experiencing was empathy. I mean, I wasn't going through a divorce. I've already done that, but they weren't either. But they were at the point to where they were ready to give up, or their spouse was saying they were ready to give up. And just, I was overwhelmed, and I do mean overwhelmed with the sadness of that. I left there, and it affected me to the point that I had to struggle seriously with it. And that's when I actually sat down over a latte to prepare for this podcast. And I read all this stuff about empathy, and immediately I woke up and thought, I'm experiencing that what's interestingly the clinicians call emotional contagion. Now, I'm the nerd, I guess. I like to know. I don't like to just wonder, what I'm feeling. There are a lot of people who study this stuff constantly, and they write things, and I do like to sort of figure out what the boundaries are, if you will. And so I thought, well, okay, so this is a thing, and what I'm doing is I am over empathizing, to use your phrase. It's not caring less for those people because I'm feeling their pain. Yeah. Rejoice with those that rejoice, suffer with those who suffer. But my suffering with them was going to prohibit me or render me unable to share someone's joy with them within the next 24 hours because I just went right into the rabbit hole with these guys. And I was feeling the terror of the possibility, the threat of the loss of that marriage. And I may have been feeling it more than they were. I don't know, because I knew what it was like. And
I think I'm going to stop you right there because exactly what you just said. And so you knew what it was like. So whether it was the exact same situation or something really similar, you knew how they felt. And I think that lies in the middle of it, of how I've experienced and how I've come to know it. And I think and I've got some more verses to go with it because I think it's really important what you said. So Hebrews 4, chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. I really like these verses a lot because for me, I think it's very difficult for us to show empathy unless we've been through it to an extent. I think you can, but you can. I think it's easier to sympathize with someone and it's harder to empathize. And I say that because it's easier for me to pity someone and say that situation sucks from the outside and not get involved with it than for me to say, man, I know that situation sucks. If you've lost a loved one, it's easier for you to be able to empathize with someone who has lost a loved one. You can feel sorry for them, say, man, I can't imagine, like, that's going to be really hard if that ever happens to me. But to be able to step into and say, I know that's painful. And so exactly what you said is these verses. And I love these verses because they're talking about Jesus. And it's Hebrews 4, 14 through 16. It says, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. And then 16 is, therefore, let us approach the throne of grace with boldness so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in time of need. And I think that's our best example. That's my best example. That's the way I've experienced it the most. And I think exactly what you said, like you've experienced it. You've walked through it with it. It's not just, you're not just yelling at somebody on the other side saying, hey, just do what you're supposed to do. Like, you're walking through them with it. You're locking arms. You're saying, I know this is tough. Let's walk through it. So
well,
that's what I love.
I love that. I love that point. I'm so glad you made it because that is so, it's so important, talking about, like, let's talk about empathy. That can sound really cold and sort of, academic. But what we're saying is that, for instance, when I go to that men's group, I can be very understanding and sympathetic, or empathetic, I guess is the better word, towards the experience that those men are having because of my own experience, which means that my experience was not all bad. If I went through a divorce, I'm not going to recommend that to anybody. But if because I have, then I can maybe be more helpful and understanding and empathetic towards a friend who is going through that. Or I might be able to help them as they consider their options in a marriage that is suffering, and give them some realistic feedback on why divorce as an option may not be as attractive as it seems, when they just can't seem to see any other way out. That's not knowledge that I would agree with you that it's a lot better for me to have experienced it and gone through it and survived it than for me to go read a book about it.
Yeah.
And try to tell you something as if I know what I'm talking about, because the reality is, until I've walked a mile in your shoes, I really should keep my mouth shut.
Yeah.
And that's a great example of how in community, we had an episode on community, but how in community, we can take the things that have happened to us that were difficult and use them to help other people in our community, because we are the voice of experience, and honestly that is quite often probably the most important thing we should seek out when we're in the situation, is someone who's been through what we've been through, because not only may they have some wisdom about it, but they also might be able to empathize with what we're experiencing better. I can give you an example of empathy that I have been unable to connect with, that unfortunately I've been put in the position of having to experience several times. I'm not that old, but I've already walked through the death of the children of several of my friends. I've had multiple friends who have lost children, and I've always heard that that a parent, it's just not right for a parent to have to bury their child. I actually watched my parents go through that when my brother passed away with cancer. It's probably the hardest thing that I've ever witnessed people go through. And I haven't just witnessed it once or twice or three times. I've stood at funerals and watched several, in my case, mostly men friends that were close friends of mine, bury their children, both their daughters and their sons. And I am unable in those instances to, I won't even allow myself to think about what that must feel like, because I have two sons, and if I went there, I think it would just completely shut me down. And so those are a couple of extreme examples of where, we may go through an experience with a friend or a relationship, and we can only empathize to a point. And the lesson here is that, you don't have to experience the death of your own child to be able to empathize with someone. We certainly can identify, to the extent we can, with suffering, the feeling of loss, the profound sadness, and all those things. And then I do think, though, that probably the most important lesson I've learned about empathy in this whole experience of looking at empathy as a thing is that I need to have a good set of boundaries, like you were talking about, where I go into a situation. Let's say in that Monday night group, the men's group that I go to, I experienced I shared the sorrow that they were sharing, just like the Bible says. But then when I leave, I move on with, the other things I need to do. I may need to go from being sorrow with them to sharing joy with somebody else. A lot of people are graduating from college and high school right now, and kindergarten. I should share their joy. And if I'm weighed down with the other people's problems in my life, then that may make me less responsive to the need to celebrate that other people feel, because sharing joy with people is every bit as important as sharing pain. Now, having said that, I will say this, in all the years I've lived, it seems to me that people, and this is going to sound awful, but people seem to enjoy indulging in other people's pain a lot more sometimes than they enjoy sharing in their joy. It seems like a lot of times you see jealousy and resentment come out in people who are experiencing joy because they're celebrating something. It's like, they're happier than I am. I don't, I'll go and, I'll get drunk at the reception, but I'm not, I'm not really, I think they're too happy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that really doesn't have anything to do with empathy, but the goal there would be to empathize more. Share their joy. It's not going to hurt you.
Yeah.
Enjoy it with them. And that's another argument for community. If I just stay alone all the time, I'm not going to experience joy or much pain other than the pain of loneliness, which is devastating. But there's so much more of an experience just of living when we interact in the lives of other people.
Yeah.
And I think the point with empathy is that there is just that it is very important for us to be mindful of what they are experiencing. That's really, in my mind nowadays, honestly, I do believe that I have come to the point where it's more important to me that you have a good experience than it is for me to have a good experience. And I think this is an act of love. Loving someone, I think, really does. It's a complicated thing, as we proved in 2 episodes about it. But love. One way I express my love toward you is to be much more concerned about the experience you're having than my own. And as long as that doesn't become damaging to me, that's probably the right thing to do.
Yeah.
It's a very loving thing.
I like how you said. I think I want to clarify this too, because I think it sounded unloving to start with. But when we're talking about having boundaries with empathy, and I think you said it correctly, and I thought of an example. So, in that example, I consider when we show empathy, we are being, and I've said it before, Jesus with skin on, right? So like, we're being, when we're able to hug someone physically, maybe because God isn't here in his human form now as he was, he uses us to do things for him. And so when we give someone a hug of comfort, when we empathize with someone, we're sharing that with them. When we leave, it does not do any good for us to make ourselves miserable on their behalf. And so I think that's where it went from. So when you pull away, at that point, you are not the Jesus with skin on in their life. So then that's when I'm going to pray for that person. And I'm going to say, hey, this person's going through a difficult time. I hope what I said was helpful. I pray that you will continue to put people in their lives that will help them in this. And then that's when I've empathized with them, but I'm not going to carry it. I'm going to think about it. I'm going to continue to pray for them. I'm going to be concerned about them, but I'm not going to just sit in discomfort.
Pathological altruism.
Yes. And I think that was an example. I was like, I want to say it like that.
I can assure you that when this happens to me, I will not be able to remember what to call it, but I'll know what it is.
Yes. Yes.
Well, we've got about 5 minutes left. So what other scriptures do you have? Any?
I've got a couple. I think what I want to come back to kind of is that the idea that, I don't know, you mentioned it, going through situations and being able to, going through bad experiences, or you mentioned going through the divorce is not something you would ever wish on someone. And it's not something anyone would call good when something like that happens. And so I think I want to speak to people who have gone through something that is not good. And just because there's that, as Christians, we have this understanding that God is working things for our good. And sometimes we mistake that to mean that everything is going to be good, or if we're doing everything right, things will be good. And sometimes bad things just happen. We talked about this, and it's so funny. Every time we talk, like the previous week, we've talked about it in our small group. Like it always comes up. But it's this idea that bad things are going to happen. It talks about the rain of blessing is going to fall on the evil and on the good, like people who are good and people who are bad. And so I like the verse in Genesis, it's chapter 50, verse 20. It says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done and saving many lives. That was Joseph talking, after talking to his brothers. And so I think that kind of understanding, and I think maybe we're given some hope that even when bad things happen to you, because of you, around you, there can be some good come out of it if you are able to empathize with someone, if you are able to be Jesus with skin onto them from something bad. And so if there's hope in that, it's that bad things will happen. That's a promise. And so I don't know. It's what we're going to do with those instead of just sitting back with a victim mindset of, well, I don't want to ever think about this again.
Mm-hmm.
If you see someone else going through it, you can say, hey, I know that sucks.
Well, yeah. I mean, I could not agree with you more. That is probably probably the best example I can think of why the ability to empathize is so important, because it enables us to take the crap that happens in our life and actually produce something with it, that is helpful to other people and a beautiful thing. A lot like a tomato. When I was young, I would use this example of how that works. God is brilliant, so He created tomatoes, tomato plants. Reach into the crap and the dirt, and they take out of it the good things that it takes to produce a tomato. And for those of us who like fresh vine grown tomatoes, it's amazing to think that came out of the dirt. But the thing that made it the tomato was that plant, and that plant knows how to reach in and take out just what it needs to take to make that magnificent tomato. And so I'm not sure how to close with that connecting to empathy, but hopefully you can empathize with what I'm thinking there.
Absolutely.
So any closing words on empathy, because we're at the end of our time on this one?
I don't think so. Don't care too much.
Don't care too much. Yeah. And use your own life experiences to look for a way to help other people who are going through the same thing. All right. Well, that's it for empathy. Not the last time we'll talk about it for sure, but for this episode, that's going to have to do. We want to thank you for listening to the Reaching Up podcast. If you're on YouTube, be sure and hit that like button. Subscribe. We're enjoying counting our subscribers. They're adding up. Tap the bell button so you'll be the first to get our next episode, which will, by the way, be on prayer. If you're listening on Spotify, iHeart, or Apple Podcasts, be sure and follow us. If you want to leave a comment, we read those, and other people do as well. Obviously, we've seen a few conversations take off. TikTok is the same way. Instagram, Facebook, and all those places. We appreciate your feedback. If you want to give us specific detailed feedback or ask questions or have a conversation with us, reach out to us by email. That's contact@reachinguppodcast.com. Contact@reachinguppodcast.com. That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening.